The most super intelligent force and power of love and creation is my shepherd, I shall not want. It maketh me to lie down in green pastures, it leadeth me beside the still waters. It restoreth my soul, it leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for its name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall continue to follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the most super intelligent power and force of love and creation possible at the highest levels of vibrational frequency forever. What's happening? Benton here. Apologies for the pause there. That's right. Amen, Sister T. The chat's back, at least for now. And Chris was first, lest we forget. Ghostface Chris. I won't be reading the chat for now. Oh, I forgot that was Christos. What's up, man? How silly of me. I see the icon. Appreciate you cruising by. Bear with me a moment. I'm having an issue where the brightness of the screen is screwing up my eyesight. So let me dim the screen. And I think I've mentioned this before. The issue is that I have to be able to know if StreamYard just randomly turns the screen off on my phone. But just being in a dark environment, but with this one light, is screwing me up, messing up my eyesight. Wow, we've even got old OTW in the chat. Interesting. Might have to rethink this live chat. Kidding. I kid. Well, if I'm being restreamed, I don't know how much I have for you folks today. I very nearly took this one off today and no stream. Excuse me. But it is a great way to start my day, get my head in the right place, and kill a little time. LA, things do begin not exactly first thing in the morning, if that makes sense. People tend to stay up very late and sleep in as much as they're able to, generally. But yeah, man, this light off of the screen. Maybe I can go to like a dark mode or something. Maybe that's the problem. The screen's too white. Let's see. Boomer time on the phone. Bear with me. Theme. There we go. Dark. Maybe that'll fix it. Nope. Still white. The web page is still white. Goodness. Oh, I prefer the no restream. But if you do, I mean, obviously, that's cool. But yeah, OTW says no restream. Yeah, we're all good either way, brother man. Just keeping my head out of a swivel. Oh, OTW says he watches me very often. Fantastic. Thank you, sir. I had a feeling that some would appreciate the critiques of the Christian religion, um, even by one such as myself who does preach on Jesus, as I did on Sunday. In fact, OTW, if you're still listening, um, I actually delivered a powerful sermon Sunday morning, right outside of a large church in the area. And definitely some folks listening, although it was interesting that one of the guys that, an usher or whatever, who's standing outside, helping guide people in or whatever, he was definitely listening attentively. But it was funny to watch him, mid sermon, to watch him, right at 10 o'clock go into the auditorium. It's a large auditorium style from what I can tell from the outside on the sidewalk. And it reminded me, there could be manifesting truth. There could be truth manifesting on the sidewalk, and because of how a person will be viewed, if they were to remain outside, listening to someone else preach. Keep it. They would not be able to keep up appearances. People would want to know, like, why weren't you in your seat when the church service began? Right. The idea that some man in the sky, right, uh, God the Father or whatever, a humanized version of the most super intelligent power and force of love and creation possible, would somehow be disappointed that the butt was not in the seat at precisely 10 a.m. Right. I mean, it was 10 on the dot. I pulled my phone out and I was like, yeah, that makes sense. And then, of course, with it being LA, there's quite a few people arriving fashionably late. So they got an earful. Um, yeah, it's good times. I enjoyed it. Um, most definitely. Most definitely. Not quite sure exactly where I'm going with this purge, although I would assume it's not the external purge, that a movie might talk about. Probably something inside of an individual that the individual may benefit from purging, something, whatever that may be, going on inside of the person. Um, as I've done, as the royal we Benton here has been able to do. And I'm finding also, and this is probably a little bit more of a pronounced effect in Southern California, but your average person, it's very difficult for them to be around someone who's claiming, some version of what could be seen as a superiority. The fact that I would claim to have, achieved something, um, that most others have never and will never achieve in this life, so-called in this death, I think was probably more correct. This death masquerading as a life, and I mean the external. The internal life of Benton here is it's been quite the wild ride, I must say. Um, so it's not the experience, it's not the novelty of experience that's lacking. It's the external, um, what's going on internally. Uh, never fails to, rarely, if ever fails to be interesting. And then, the notion of all of this, you know, uh, social media self improvement, folks going to TikTok, YouTube, and following various channels and life coaches and gurus, and what I've talked about, the conventional wisdom, um, the word of mouthing of everything all of the time, so-called common sense, which clearly does not exist. Um, and the word, all the better that it doesn't exist, certainly. Um, so it's seemingly okay for people, again, within their peer groups, to seek out life coaching and all of these tips and tricks, and follow a system, and a certain diet, and maybe some nootropics, and psych meds for some folks. And well, the job market is bad, as if this is new information. The corporation doesn't care about the worker, and well, they're going to fire you and lay off the worker anytime it suits them, so there's no loyalty, so act accordingly. And um, being taught all of these things through social media, so there's some recognition of a growth process, right? The individual potentially growing and changing and evolving, and needing to pick up new skills. Of course, a lot of this tied into employment via the vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of business transactions. But then, little to no recognition of a progression within the individual mind, body, and spirit, and spirit being a key component. Um, and the audacity, or the insanity from their perspective, the mental illness, from their perspective, again, of somebody, like Benton, or, sometimes when I'm giving these sermons or public speaking, accused of being on drugs, which is hilarious because whoever is accusing most likely has a greater, especially in Los Angeles, whoever is accusing would most likely have a far greater experience with illicit drugs than old Benton here, who's at a zero on cocaine, a zero on meth, and a zero on opiates. Not even once. Um, and not that that's a point of pride, it's the way things have worked out. Certainly not going to turn any of those zeros into a one at this point. No, thank you. Um, so that's interesting to observe, and then it ties back into you know recent assertions on this channel around the futility and more or less the impossibility of even grouping up with other people in the external, in the world of death, within games of lies. um, and as we see humans needing to put themselves in a group in order to cope or to accomplish almost anything. And it is funny, these notions of social isolation, even before the pandemic, the system promoting in America off the charts levels of social isolation, which are certainly present. But then when I walk around, and some of this may be that Benton is in close proximity to a park, but I mostly see people walking in pairs or small groups, and then sometimes large groups. Now there's certainly individuals, but a lot of the individuals have their animal with them, their dog, their canine. So just the unaccompanied human being, uh, walking around, it's present, but it's less of a thing than perhaps folks would otherwise realize. And then a lot of people probably spending maximum amounts of time in their apartment. And hey, with what rent costs these days, does it even make financial sense to not maximize the amount of time one spends in their own dwelling? Because and it's expensive everywhere. This idea that well, there's still places that are cheap. It's like, well, I'm from one of the poorest states there is, and it's not cheap. It's less expensive than many areas in the country, certainly. Uh, it's not no longer cheap. Uh, no, it is not. That does not seem to be a thing anywhere. Certainly, it's like, yeah, I know where to rent uh, a converted motel room, lacking amenities in Portsmouth, Arkansas, which is one of the cheapest housing markets in the country, certainly. Um, and if one wanted to buy a house and live somewhere, various parts of Arkansas certainly would fit the bill with the amount of money required to purchase a home. But there's just nothing to do there. There's nothing going on. There's nothing happening. Um, but yeah, $700 a month. But if I was to try to work a hourly job to pay for the room, $11 an hour would be about the max. And then it would be doable based on location. Walking to a Walmart about a mile, maybe a mile and a half away. And then the low pay also would be necessitated by a place that would most likely employ me for $11 an hour is also nearby. But then what's that? 40 hours, $440. Then knock off, I don't know, 15 to 20% withholding. What's that? 440, 44, 66, whatever that math comes out to be, somewhere around about what I was making working in a convenience store, 15 years ago. Be somewhere around $375 a week. So that's almost 2 weeks' pay to pay for the $700. So the $700 sounds okay. Well, that sounds doable, except, well, that's almost half of the take-home pay. And historically, budgeting has talked about, well, you don't want to pay 25% is the sweet spot which is what, 1 week's pay to pay for the place to live. And then, max 30% is sort of, again, the conventional wisdom. Um, and, I'm going to sidestep the how are we supposed to live part. Well, you're not. People are like, well, how are folks supposed to live with, inflation, tariffs, cost of living, housing prices? Well, you're not. Uh, one is not expected to live in a world of death. That's a quite the leap in logic. That's quite the assumption. Um, the notion that this place, this realm is set up that the individual or the family, right, would be able to live and afford a life. Now, the greater one's willingness to serve Moloch's machine and to, fulfill a corrupt function in service of, the power structure, rich folks, what I refer to as the administrators at the top, on behalf of the so-called elites. The people who are referred to as elites really that's who works for the elites, actually. And then the elites presumably would be the last layer before, the shot caller of this world of death, right? Whether that's a personification referred to as Satan, or if that's, antithesis, or, Moloch's machine as some sort of a mob boss, working for antithesis. However that's structured, probably doesn't matter, neither here nor there. And a lot of people have different notions of what that is, and what that would be called, and it doesn't really matter. And then, but when addressing the purge, the idea, well, an external purge, what would need to be purged externally, right, in order to have a proper society? Which, lest we forget, America has never had a proper society. People are like, what do you mean? What about hearing about how wonderful things were in the recent past? Well, I was there for some of that. It was not wonderful. And, I enjoy watching some of these YouTube videos about, the collapse of various regions of the country and, the Rust Belt. And the reality is, much of America was already like visually crumbling by 1960. And, this cycle of building up, certain areas of cities and then only to watch them collapse again into rubble. That seems to certainly be a repeating pattern. And the notion that any of that is being done to serve humanity and serve the citizens in the first place. Well, no, it's done to serve corporations and businesses. And, in the planning and operation of these corporations, these industries, it has to be well known ahead of time, when the structure is built, whether it's a factory, a warehouse, some sort of distribution center, would not the powers that be, so-called, understand there's a certain life cycle to this part of town, to this, let's call it an industrial district in Memphis, just near the Mississippi River, where old Benton has driven big rigs in and out of that area. Not a lot, but certainly more than a few times. And just seeing the buildings, when were they constructed? Most likely, early 60s, some of that in Memphis. But then, on the other side of town is the more modern facilities, probably built in the mid 1980s, and maybe even newer, right? And what is the planning of all of that? And then, the citizens, or the civilians, and that's more of a slang term, really. Just the regular folks, um, laboring under this misapprehension that this is all being done somehow for their benefit. It's like, no, quite the contrary. It's certainly not. Um, and the reconciliation of all of these various factors in order to do what? To get through one's day, to fit in with their own relatives, to fit in with the local community and the local peer groups. Well, uh, the local community across this nation, and I mean every state, every county, every city. Now, are there exceptions to this? Yeah, of course, there are exceptions. There are rare few exceptions. So does that even matter, right? What's the difference? And maybe the system allows for that as some sort of control group to sort of, maintain appearances and well, let's see what happens in these few little pockets where maybe some of the officials in charge are not completely corrupted. But um, the reality is that every, again, accounting for the minority of possible exceptions, effectively, right? And again, accessing hyperbole and understanding that an anecdotal evidence can never negate the validity of these broad general statements that I'm making. Effectively, every single individual in a position of power or authority in America is corrupted. Otherwise, they would not be capable of doing their job. Their job requires a lack of integrity. Their job requires, some measure of performing as a psychopath or a sociopath. It requires all of these things with their humanity intact and their principles intact. These administrators and elected officials and politicians would not be able to do the job. And then we see so many in the so-called truth community, which leads me back to how many of these folks are system agents, how many of these folks are, so mind controlled in the so-called truth community that they can't, parse out these details. But, as soon as Benton starts talking this way, it immediately gets put into, well, no, that's the Democrats doing all of that, which immediately applies that Republicans would do any better. Well, there's no precedent for Republicans doing anything to benefit the proletariat, the underclass, the workers of America. There's no precedent for that because Republicans never operate in a vacuum. Rarely, if ever, does either party behave with impunity to be able to pass their agenda unopposed. That almost never happens. Now, sometimes there's windows of time when it's a Republican, in office in the presidency, and then it's a Republican both chambers of Congress. But then you still have the judicial branch to invalidate and nullify some of the laws, but then you have the executive branch, just able to, you know, uh, swipe of a pen, law of the land type shit through executive orders. And again, we all know this is hocus pocus on some level. It's theater, you know. Politics is Hollywood for ugly people on some level, and there is no constitution that, as far as from the people's perspective, that's not even a thing. Um, the idea of my rights. Well, how can a psychological slave have rights? A psychological slave, a person who's psychologically enslaved. What do you mean, right? Huh? What does that even mean in the context of a populace that's psychologically enslaved and unable to think for themselves, and in fact, um, depend upon prepackaged ideas being, uh, you know, sent to them via push notification, whether literal or figurative or both. What's the relevance of a potential for rights? You know, and especially within a system, a world of death and games of lies, and a system that only understands the languages of power and money. And that's so yeah, maybe there's a constitution that talks about a redress of grievances, except that does it say in there that you better make that in the form of power or money, otherwise the government can't hear you. Doesn't know it's Charlie Brown, wah 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 wah, marching through the streets in a protest. The government hears wah 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 wah, and the corporations and the powers that be certainly will take advantage of rioting or whatever may be happening at the level of a protest. And then the propaganda certainly rolls on unfettered as a result, and nothing changes. And this is what I mean about ideas prepackaged and people not thinking for themselves. I've seen a lot of this anti-ICE type stuff. here in LA. And the reality is, you know, the ridiculousness of watching people protest and then understanding that virtually all of them are going back to a job to pay for ICE. You know, how does ICE receive its funding, right? How does the government propagate itself? Folks have to go to work. And then the one measure that would presumably have an effect if people wanted to stop the deportations and they wanted to stop the roundups, it's called don't go to work for a couple of weeks. And then immediately the fear kicks in, and the psychological enslavement will not allow people to just say, fuck it, I'm living my principles. I'm not paying for the government until the government stops doing these actions that I find unacceptable. So to verbalize how unacceptable things are, but then to act in support of the unacceptable. Right? And this is Orwellian, certainly. And we see this with the so-called left-right paradigm, and we see this with the so-called MAGA types, where what gets them going is hearing a figurehead, whoever that may be, whether it's Trump or someone else, is to hear them uh, verbalize rhetoric that sounds good, but demanding no actual actions, as far as actions that would in any way enhance the lives of the citizens. Even, you know, the idea of half the citizens, which is not half, but you're more like a third, but of folks who might identify as Republican. And old Benton here, I remember the olden days when the majority of Americans would not, they would not willingly identify themselves as, oh, I'm a Republican, or oh, I'm a Democrat. Now, maybe they understand that they may need to register as a Democrat or register as a Republican, just like Trump understood at a certain point for his own purposes, he was a registered Democrat. But in 2025, that's by some people viewed as the, you know, that's the height of possible evil in the country. And then those are the same people falling in line behind the rhetoric of Trump, who was registered as a member of what's now viewed as evil. See, and no ability for these people to reconcile any of this. And how is that never, you know, how does nobody in those groups ever say, well, you know, look at what we're doing here. Look at, you know, if we as a group, and I'm not in that group, but if they as a group want to be effective and actually believe in cleaning up the streets, and they believe in, you know, certain, you know, law and order, and if they really want to live these things on the so-called right, you know, they are unaware of their own behaviors that prevents them from effectively addressing any of the social problems that have, again, they've all been here fully present since at least 1960 and probably earlier. And, you know, Benton here talking about the purge and having purged, you know, much of the damage wrought by, you know, existing and surviving within this vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of business transactions for so many years now, right? Um, I'm even feeling some type of way just speaking about these issues. I really, I can feel the change in the internal space. You know, that some of the woke up feeling no pain in the tissues of the thoracic, right? Which I've been in pain 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You know, pretty much my entire adult life in those areas. And you know, there's been relief of late uh, on the heels of the unlocking of the achievement within the game of lies of true knowledge of self slash self realization. Um, and then, you know, the horror of this world of death, decadence, depravity, and all of these things, and to even speak on it and recognize what's going on within myself individually, and recognizing that in the past it wouldn't have even been discernible because of how much junk, you know, and healing, and whether it's PTSD or it's repressed trauma, it's stagnated energies that had never been dealt with, whatever that, however that manifests or exists, having purged so much of that, um, it's much more sensitive, the physical what seemed to be the physical reactions within the being myself, which is Benton in this case, and recognizing that any other being that is the same as what I am would certainly be, almost certainly be going through their own versions of that, and then what processes and practices would be available to those individuals that they could undergo their own purging process, which is healing on some level. Um, and my experience of the great healing is, you know, it entered in, it became, receiving of healing, and that healing has continued over what has now been a great, period of time, and continues in each moment from Benton's perspective. And what is that? Well, that's when referencing Christ or Jesus Christ or the Lord Jesus Christ, that's what I'm referring to. And it's a power, it's a force. And in fact, same as what I know myself to be, not a personality. Part of what the historical Jesus would have been a personality, a history, a biography, um, a story, personal relationships, certainly, and all of these various things. Um, Same with Benton, right? But this idea of what I am is the way, what I am is the truth, what I am is the life. I certainly have confirmed that to all be true within myself, and being having no power externally, because here's the thing: is how can life, how can the uh, a being that's one with the supreme authority and the source of life itself, how can there be any life outside of the individual within a delusion, right? How can, once my focus and concentration and once experience leaves the internal energy sphere out into the external, how can there be life there, right? Now, of course, there's the potential, setting aside the philosophy of solipsism, there's the potential that there's other discrete, individuated within delusion beings who are also one with that force, that indivisible force, which which proves that this realm has to be a delusion or a series of delusions. Where how can the nature be alive in a world of death? And then see people say, well, how can you, Benton, be alive in a world of death? Because what I am will never know death. And so is this some version of Christ after the crucifixion in the story of the Bible? Did not Christ travel the underworld before the resurrection? So, mate, for all I know, this is the underworld. And, old Benton here hasn't found his way out quite yet. And then, is there even a personality in a story? And see, that's what the individual, and that's what most of the individuals are so closely identified with. It's not just the realm itself. They are identified with the image, the graven image that they've been indoctrinated to create, to uphold before Moloch, to get the attaboys and the pat on the head. You've done a good evil job here in this world of death and game of lies type shit, in order to earn a living, portray a certain image on social media, to have the both the necessities and the good things, the so-called good things in life, right? Um, but knowing that what I am is one with the source of all, that exists and can exist, then how could there possibly be anything of value, or how can there be anything alive from the perspective of life itself present in the realm? Because supreme authority, the highest forms of creation, and the source of life itself certainly would have the power and ability to animate whatever is here in a world of death. See, to make it seem to be alive. So the trees grow, the blades of grass, at times perceptibly sway in the wind to a minute degree, right? The sun, which I enjoy very much within this experience, big fan of the sun, SUN. Um, Shout out to this is still my month, right, as a Leo. Um, and yes, I understand there's a late July component, but not into that so much. And forgetting that Virgo gets a week of August, right? But we're still, I think, it's not past the 22nd yet. I don't believe. Maybe it is. Are we still that close to my? It doesn't even matter. Benton's birthday is not relevant here. Um, and hopefully my points are well taken here. And then, like talking to my mom about some of this, and her immediately rejecting these ideas. And I called her on it too, because especially women, but not just women, have this great ability to immediately tell a man why he's wrong, even though I know for a fact she's never had these ideas. So it's to be and it's not, it's more than just a female or a woman, being afflicted by this. They just seem to be more. It's actually that the men really just aren't on a high enough level to be able to immediately. It's a lack of intelligence on the part of the males to some extent. Um, and maybe some integrity around, well, I've never heard any of this. But so imagine I'm saying something to my mother that I know she's never heard, but because it runs contrary to her belief system, that was, she allowed a mind control cult to install this belief system in conjunction with whatever, her pre-existing belief systems were. And so upon hearing something that runs contrary, something she's never considered or thought about for half a second in her entire life, because Benton and these novel ideas, and not everything Benton is addressing here is a novel idea that originates with Benton, but a lot of it is. And I know people are being disingenuous and lying to me when they claim to have heard this before. It's like, well, I've lived in a life of information gathering almost obsessively. Other folks haven't. So how is it that I've never heard anybody say these things other than myself when they came out of my mouth for the first time? So my mother hearing certain ideas around, well, this place isn't even alive in the first place, right? Yeah, the trees and all of this seems to be living. And then so telling her that, just the immediate reaction, and I called her on it. I said, well, you've never considered any of this. Oh, yes, I have. No, you're lying. No, you haven't. You're telling me why I can't possibly be correct. And meanwhile, you've had uh, we're now up to about 5 seconds that you've spent with these ideas. And then I walked around 10 miles a day for every day for years on end, pondering and developing and internally bootstrapping and spiritually practicing to purge enough of the bullshit that's in the way inside of myself, or that was in the way. And how much of these spiritual practices and all of this is merely an unlearning, get shed of all the junk that's in the way of the being able to perceive clearly, to clearly perceive, get all that junk out of the way. Well, my mother certainly still has a lot of junk in the way. My mother's, programmable certainly. And I apologize for deviating from the main topic, but um, hopefully I know I was on a pretty decent thread there. So hopefully I'll be able to run this one in parallel and maybe jump back to the original thread, hopefully bring it full circle to sort of mix the metaphors there. Now we're into shapes. We got two parallel lines, but then now I'm drawing a circle somewhere. What's going on? Or maybe maybe we lose both threads. That's funny. What did old mom do that I wanted to bitch about? Oh, see, here's the thing about I won't call it genius, but expert level pattern recognition. Having access to that, but not in the moment. My pattern recognition works on the back end. So from listening to what my mother has said in our interactions, I know for a fact that my middle sister is taking advantage of my mother's programmability, because I've heard my mother say things to me in a psychological warfare context, and it's third party. Here's how gaslighty and Machiavellian and just predatory and nightmarish this world of death is, and these games of lies, is that I hear things coming out of my mother's mouth, and later on I dissect the psychology of these things and recognize, well, these ideas could not possibly have originated with my mother. Now, maybe she's a little more high level with the psychological warfare than I ever realized. That's certainly possible. But it seems to me like it's my middle sister who's operating her by extension to some extent. And again, males fall victim to this as well, but it does seem to be, at the risk of picking on the ladies. Not that there's very few around. Apparently, there's a couple. I've ran most of them off, but there's a few that listen. Although most of them are getting their beauty sleep, I would have to think anyway at this time in the morning. But the point here is that, and I noticed this with my second wife also, who had this very, her best friend was very adept at psychological warfare, as is Benton. And there were times when my second wife would say something to me, and I would immediately say, that's not you talking. I said, that's your best friend. I said, I'm in a relationship with you, not your best friend. And I said, when you introduced me to your best friend, right when we started dating, if I wanted to date the both of you, I just would have dated the both of you, right? And that's not me bragging. You know, that's something that would have been possible at the time. Now, it would have been detrimental to old Benton. You want to talk about being drained? I'm here to completely drain you, right? She's certainly, the best friend was certainly some version of an energy vampire. Uh, and Benton will work a brag in here and there. And both these ladies quite attractive, of course. Not that that matters, right, fellas? Most fellas will. Anyway, I don't even want to get into that, but either way. So and this is spiritual warfare. So what happened was, right before, in the time right before the unlocking of the achievement of true knowledge of self, I was being spiritually attacked in various ways through, acquaintanceships, friendships. Not that I had many, but I was being spiritually attacked that way, spiritually attacked on the streets, lots of spiritual attacks. And then my own mother was spiritually attacking me because my baby sister has had a lot of problems as an adult, coping with, her perceptions of being damaged by the way she was raised. And my baby sister has a lot of rage inside of her. And well, guess who also had a lot of that rage? Benton here, except not anymore. The rage is gone. So there was still some of that rage and wrath left over last time I saw my mother in the flesh. And here's where we get into turning the other cheek. Well, she had said something, and I know this is a long way around to make a point, but she had said something about, more or less that I would, become very angry, and it's kind of a neurodivergent type thing too. It's an undiagnosed fake autism thing in a way. It's a very focused wrath, and it's a wrath that most people just are not able to withstand in the moment. It sort of just, it sets everything on fire. It's such a strong anger and rage. It's a very powerful force, but not necessarily in a good way, or generally not in a good way. Well, my baby sister, has some of that certainly. And so my mother began to put me in a group with my baby sister and refer to whatever I had going on at the level of my behavior, and then lumping me in with my baby sister. Well, what better way to further annoy and anger? You got three children who are grown adults in middle age, and you got one male with medically provable high testosterone, and then you got the two females. And now I'm being compared to my baby sister at the level of my emotional states. Well, that's never going to fly. But again, turning the other cheek is to forgive the first transaction. So the last time I saw my mother in person, it was basically like, hey, I'm angry. And this was a performance, right? This is again back to the idea of intelligent performance. My mother, in a 5-minute conversation in her car, in a parking lot in Harrison, Arkansas. I'm sorry, Mountain Home, Arkansas, one town over from YouTube's so-called most racist town in America, Harrison, Arkansas. And then sitting there knowing that I'm angry, knowing that spiritually, right, and not knowing that I was on the verge of unlocking this achievement within the game, and also understanding that the spiritual attack I was under wanted me to just read her the riot act, right? And my baby sister reads her the riot act, and my mother used to just put up with it, and my mother would be guilt ridden and shameful, and apologizing and always seeking to make things right with my baby sister. And then at a certain point, my mom told me, well, this time, she's going to have to apologize, like, which is good to set those boundaries, or it's really none of my business. I don't know why I was informed, but um, and again, we're back to the idea of my contention that familial love is mostly a myth. Are there exceptions? Of course, but and some might say, well, that's been your experience. This is not our experience. And it's like, well, I'm putting my experiences in with a lifetime of observance. And many years ago, I dedicated myself for a time to becoming the best poker player I possibly could. And that involved an acknowledgement of what? Examining my internal space and realizing that, what? I have behaved as some version of Mr. Magoo in my life, meaning just oblivious to a lot of things happening because of my own refusal to develop my own powers of observation. And nobody's going to become a great poker, and I wasn't great, but nobody's going to become competent poker player. It's necessary to train oneself to observe the environment. It has to happen. So, and I was able to effectively train myself to be very observant, and which then served me greatly when I transitioned into street life and homelessness. It's very important to be aware of one's surroundings. And that's the number one thing country folk or people who are not acquainted with the city lack, is they lack that awareness of being able to observe unfamiliar environments and to properly decode what may be happening. They're simply not aware enough of what's going on around them, and especially how their body language sends messages to the environment, right? Meaning, the first time I went to downtown Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I like architecture, and I'm looking up at the buildings. Well, if I'm being observed by the locals, that's a key. Hey, we got some yokel in the big city. Let's go see if we can rob him. So then I see the three black fellas headed my way. So I know, and this is back when I still had muscles. So I know to go monkey man, dominant body language, walk right at them and stare them down, and just let them know, like, hey, man, maybe you can take my shit, but I'm finna fight you as hard as I can. See, somebody from the fucking country or who's not acquainted with the city doesn't understand that. Now, the fact that I have city skills and I like architecture and I enjoy looking at buildings has nothing to do with the fact that predators will misinterpret my body language. And then, so what's the key to that? It's my job to then send them the signal of, no, not me. I know what you are. I know what you're about. I'm not here to stamp out that activity, right? It's just I'm letting them know that I'm not the person that this is ever going to happen with. It happened one time in Portland, Oregon, where I saw a group of gutter punks, crusty kids, led by a guy maybe my age, and they decided they were from across the street. They were going to rob me of my backpack. And I knew this by how they were looking at me and how they were talking amongst themselves. And as they crossed the street towards me, I crossed the street towards them, and all of our heads turned to look at each other. And I just nodded and went, mm-hmm, believe that, and just stopped. And then I ended up where they came from and just stood and looked at them. And then they were where I came from looking at me. And I'm just looking at them like, really? Really? But if I didn't understand what was happening, they absolutely would have, done everything in their power to rob me of my backpack and whatever else I may have had on me. This is part of why I've never been, to this point, it's never happened. Okay. And again, this is the individual working on themselves and improving themselves over time. And there's spiritual components to that. There's physical components to that. There's mental focus components to that. There's observational components to that. There's, being tapped into one's own intuition, because, the Mr. Miyagis of the world will say, how could you possibly have known that? Well, I knew it. I knew that what they were going to do. What do you mean? It's called intuition, sir. It's knowledge gained outside of logic and reason. How could you possibly know that? Intuition combined with deductive reasoning, combined with personal experience. I mean, it's really not that. It's not a head scratcher, sir. It's really not. So back to this stuff with my baby sister. So what we have here is, if you have three siblings and a mother and a father, so the pattern that's established itself, it hasn't established itself yet, is me being put in a group with one of my siblings, but not all three. So we have my middle sister standing apart from this grouping of me and baby sister, right? And then on this last phone call, my mother used the same pattern. She put me in a group with, and I'm trying, but in a different context. She utilized the same technology of psychological attack and spiritual attack. And I've actually forgotten the context of that. Maybe I shall remember in a moment. She said something about, and I didn't catch it in the moment. And this is where, again, Benton's not that quick on the uptake. I'm not that great in the moment necessarily. It takes me a while to figure stuff out. But then the 24 hours a day, 7 days a week analytical processes going on in the brain, it doesn't take that long. Give it a few days, right? And then we have epiphanies, just fully formed concepts popping into the conscious mind. Well, how big of an IQ does the individual need when the ideas are just, here you go? And when I talk about the general public having ideas packaged and sent to them, packaged outside of themselves and sent to them via push notification. Well, these are ideas originating within me, right? And then just there they are, poof, in the conscious mind, right when I need them. And the fact that I've forgotten what she did utilizing the same form of psychological warfare and spiritual attack, it doesn't even matter really. But the same pattern. So I'm recognizing the same pattern. So now, what does my mother represent, as far as having some sort of relationship, or, well, it's a being who is able to be utilized by other forces in different contexts to undermine and attack and to attempt to sway Benton from his path, right? While also having her own version of keeping up appearances and being a mother with a son, some version of having to pretend to give a fuck, and for her own benefit, and then recognizing that my mother and my father are probably equally void at the level of, uh, soullessness, and I hate to put it that way. Um, and I will never know if that's the case or not, speaking merely from my perspective. Um, you know, I know, so part of the unlocking of the achievement within the game, knowing that what I am is one with that force of love. Well, now I know what love is, right? Well, in knowing what love is, and whilst immediately understanding that to declare such a thing, now my performance, back to intelligent performance, will be observed and cataloged and critiqued. And any moment my behavior seemingly falls away from what would be considered loving, right, is now the being will be under attack. But here's the thing: there's no love present in this world of death and game of lies. Love does not originate in this place. In fact, everything that originates, that can trace its origins to this place, that is to be originated based on a lack of love, the antithesis of love, right? So what's love got to do with it? So to be attacked on that basis is to be attacked based on what? A false image of what the antithesis of love would, how the antithesis of love, the inverse or the opposite of love, would um, describe love or would expect love to be. But just like the most super intelligent force of love and creation possible has no concept of potential calamities or catastrophes that could befall the being within a vacuous, illusory, adversarial realm of business transactions, it's the same thing in reverse or inverse or opposite for antithesis. It doesn't have a way to conceptualize love, only based on the inverse of love. See? It's based on a lack of love. That's its understanding of love. Benton's understanding of love is having access to the real thing. See? And to constantly, continuously receive love. But where? See, now we're back to time, space, location, place. Where is Benton receiving the love and on what basis? Well, unconditionally, number one, because that's the nature of love. The moment condition gets involved, that's your first clue that it's not love. First clue. Oh, there's a condition. Well, love doesn't know what condition, that doesn't know what that means. Love can't relate to a condition placed upon what it is as it manifests. Doesn't know what you're talking about. Doesn't speak those languages. Just like the government only speaking the languages of power and money. Right? It doesn't know what you mean. Okay. And literally doesn't know what, just that's a true statement. So I'm now understanding that my mother and my father certainly has no conception of what love is. And that my opinion on that will never change. And I'm now realizing that probably my mother as well. And then most likely one of my two siblings. And then unfortunately, as much as now we're getting into the, addressing the internal space, old Benton here, I don't think he knew either. Uh, maybe fleetingly experienced it more than these other folks. Maybe they're at pretty close to zero, but then, maybe I was experiencing love, but in a limited fashion. And well, that's all been unlocked, the transforming of the heart, right? And so this is a new Benton in a way. Um, knowing what that is and understanding that this realm, it just simply, love does not exist here outside of the individual. So what I'm talking about with this direct access to love, well, that's within the individual. Again, the Bible, the kingdom of God is within me. God is love and the kingdom of God is within me. So it's not to be found outside of myself. It's to be found inside of myself. Right. And then, what I am seemingly desires worship. Well, worship in this place, in the vacuous, illusory, adversarial realm of business transactions, you got the giving of love and the receiving of love. Well, same fucking thing. Giving is receiving. But this, so from the perspective of antithesis in a world of death, love is, what people are taught love is not what love is. This is a process that's going on within myself, and that is the continuous renewal of the spirit. The cup runneth over, right? It's like a fountain of love, continuously showering and going back up and showering and going back up and showering. And in fact, a lot of these spiritual practices with the visualizations and the guided meditations, these things I was in 2 years ago, a lot of those guided meditations, I'm realizing now, is a fake defunct version or a fake it till you make it version of what I'm now directly experiencing, right? Some of those guided meditations was to visualize, something akin to what is now being described, if that makes sense. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. So, when I'm hearing, if I'm looking at a YouTube video about the possibility of these evil entities and psychological warfare and the spiritual warfare, and then the necessity for, you know, almost like a spell of protection, right? Um, to counteract all of that. Well, my experience is that when the being unlocks certain achievements, so where I start from is that the being has, if the being is what I am, one with that force, the being has access to all spiritual practices, all spiritual powers and attainments. It's the individual has been taught to block the individual's access to those abilities and powers. So, in fact, a lot of the spiritual growth and the spiritual practices is teaching oneself to no longer create the blockage on an ongoing basis through the yang form. Again, assertion, aggression, dominance. Right, man will dominate man into his own injury. A lot of that is the creating of these blockages to prevent a spiritual being, if in fact that's what the being is, from accessing their own spirituality, which is their birthright if they are what I am and they were born into spiritual perfection. And this was a big part of yesterday morning's sermon outside of the church. Right, this was a big component of it. It's to be born into spiritual perfection, and then to be sacrificed to Moloch, and then to be taught by this world, including the church, how to block all of these things and how to be a good little servant of evil, death, destruction, depravity, and business transactions, of course. Right. And that is what's happening in this place, or at least that's what's happening at the level of waking dreams, surrealistic notions of unreality, right? Because it's on some level, it's actually not happening at all, as the royal we knows. Um, and I know I opened a couple of can of worms in there that I really wanted to address, so maybe we can get back to those in the course of this, perhaps the royal we. I don't know what's going on in the chat. Hopefully, it's not flame wars yet. Let's see. Let's take a quick gander. All right, shout out to the chat. I see you down there. And it's really been helpful to Benton here to recognize that just how void this realm is. In fact, again, what I am is the only accessible substance because the delusion is created based on an individuation that can never happen, which is to individuate an indivisible force. Right. And so that's where, and I'm okay. Here's a point I wanted to make much earlier and didn't quite make. So, what precludes the individual, and part of what entraps the individual is being so closely identified with this realm and these experiences, and that's causes the individual to create the graven image, and then they relate to that image as if that in fact becomes an avatar, or it subsumes or subverts the actual real identity of the individual. So the real identity of beings that trace their origin, and origin isn't even the proper term, but beings that are what I am, which is living manifested truth, among other things, right? Source of life, supreme authority, all of these things. It's to then, so the image, the world of death and the game of lies, based on the notions of antithesis, that is now in the way, right? And that's the thing that's looked to as, well, Benton, the psychology, the so-called ego, the collection of novel experiences, the physical appearance, the physical body, all of that in some way needs to be defended, or it needs to be clung to, and various um, various undertakings must happen within the world of death and the game of lies in this delusory and illusory realm. Certain actions must be undertaken so that, when bad shit goes on, that there's still a path to returning to, the larger force, or the thing that I'm one with. And what I'm here to say is that's simply not the case for Benton, because part of the true knowledge of self here, and speaking only for Benton within the context of the delusion, is what Benton is never not one with that force. So there can't be a fear, and what Benton is can't fear the loss of Benton the personality, Benton the performer, Benton the characteristics. You know, there is nothing to lose there, because that's not the life. The life is not Benton with a particular a particular facial structure, and a human body that produces certain chemicals, right? And born in a certain place, speaks a certain type of way. That's not what I am. See? So there's no fear, and what I am can't fear anyway, but there's no reason, there's no valid or logical reason to fear the loss of something that was never real in the first place. So Benton the performer, and this is what I believe happens with a lot of these people who commit these atrocities, if those things are really happening, right? If we go official fiction, if some of these horrific crimes and sprees are really happening, I would assume some of that does happen. But so it seems like a lot of those individuals, and having heard interrogation videos and enjoying true crime, it seems like a lot of those individuals do come into some measure of understanding via the waking dream surrealistic notions of unreality, but it's generally that they get there through their own version of being a male incel, their own discontent, their own being constantly rejected by the environment leads them to the discovery of some of these things. But these are individuals who never developed themselves. And so I think a lot of people would recognize the dangers in the way that Benton is speaking with respect to the unreality and, well, my own notion of Benton as a phenomenon. Well, that's not even real, strictly speaking, because anything that can trace its origins to this realm is dead. Well, that includes Benton's physical appearance. That includes Benton's characteristics, his accent, his vocal tone, his the fact that some people find his facial structure pleasing. Right? None of that's what I am. None of that's important outside of the context of this delusory realm. So there's no, hey, Benton needs to make sure to bring all this with him wherever he goes next, because, well, wait a minute, outside of this delusion, there is no time, space, place, and location. It's only the one indivisible force, and contained within that force is all of these possible experiences, including, and also the inclusion of antithesis. It has to be included. Otherwise, the whole thing wouldn't work in the first place. If there's no antithesis it contained within the proposition or the thesis, how can there be a proposition or a thesis without antithesis? It seems to me like both must be present or potentially present, right? Because if there could be nothing, would there not be nothing, right? Just void. How is that even possible? It doesn't seem to be possible. So in describing these various mechanisms, and Benton simply will not cling to this experience. Benton refuses, just won't do it. Certainly much of, and now into some of the Buddhist philosophy to some extent. Well, what creates suffering? It's the attachment, right? Well, they say, well, the attachment does. Well, attachment to the real concrete existence of a physical body, a biography, a performer, a performance, right? A psychology, a thought process. See, that's what is creating the suffering. It's not necessarily what's going on externally, although of course that plays a part, or what's seemingly going on externally, right? So back to the worship, and seemingly individuals, even if they're soulless, maybe they've then been incentivized into behaving as if there's some kind of component for worship. But then are those the folks that are more inclined to just say, oh, well, I need to fit into the community, and the community's expectation is that I'm going to put my butt into the church pew. I'm going to put my butt in the seat in the church, at least 2 Sundays a month or whatever that is, and that's what they go and do, if that's the expectation in their communities, right? Some people I see walking around, their expectation in their peer groups is that they're going to wear satanic T-shirts and tattoo all kind of satanic symbols on their bodies, right? Different flavors of the same thing. The church is just as demonic. True knowledge is to understand that the church is just as demonic as the people who walk around with the satanic symbols on their flesh and the satanic symbols on their clothing. It's equally demonic. Now you have your Democrat versus Republican structure yet again, right? Oh, well, it looks like there's a choice between good and evil, but then the choice is presented in a world of death via games of lies is to be presented death, two different flavors of death. See, because if the church could ever in all of human history have properly said to represent light, love, and creation, would not the darkness of satanic activity, it would have no choice but to flee. So how did the Leviathan of maximum spiritual attack, how did it rise to the surface during the pandemic? And then what observably happened is the vast majority of all humans immediately fell into line with that, and regrettably old Benton went along with some of it as well. He didn't want to, he didn't like it, but he did. And what's the difference? Antithesis, after pausing the game in the course of making its appeals via legalese and some courtroom scene from Devil's Advocate, do you think the prosecution's going to draw those distinctions? Even if the defense team tries to draw those distinctions, is the judge going to allow it? So what's the fucking difference? What's the fucking difference? Let me check the time. We're coming up nearing the end of the StreamYard free time. So that's probably enough for the main meat of the discourse. So, all right, we're done. We're done. You've outlived your usefulness. Uh, I don't even want to say what's happened here, but a user got banned, and pretty pleased with sugar on top. You're welcome to stick around and listen, but uh, the banned individual's services are no longer required. This is not anything personal, but old Benton here is not going to be able to continue to do his broadcasts. It's either never have a live chat again or never ever read one of that commenter's comments ever again. So I've chosen the latter, but no animosity, no ill will, no vendetta, solely based on the content of the commentary, solely based in your own thoughts and ideas and the way your brain works at the present time. Somewhat regrettably, but and that's another notion. See, Antithesis's notion of love is to treat each individual, humanely with some modicum of compassion and care, which I do agree with in a context. I do agree with treating people that way, but again, I have no way of confirming that that's a real actual human being in the way that I'm not a human being, but again, knowing what I am, the true essence or so-called soul. What's the benefit to Benton of continuing to engage with certain folks? I mean, there's just simply no upside, but there's a potential downside. So it's in a detached fashion to say, okay, I've had enough of this. There's no anger. Because in the past it would have been out of anger. It would have been a culling or what was the word for this? An incision, a scalpel-like incision, excising. There you go. It would have been an excision, if that's a word, because of emotion, right? This was not that, and it's not as a punishment. It's hey, this doesn't serve the purpose of what I am. See, it's not consistent, and then perhaps there are individuals who listen to these broadcasts who get something out of this, perhaps beyond entertainment, and in the struggles and to cope with life, the fact that there does seem to be something of a hardcore audience for this material. So when Benton, and I'll give you an example of what caused me and then, as we know, most of these folks who get banned will make a new name and come back, right? And that's part of the process. And whether or not this is one of these people, who knows? Um, but it's to derail a conversation, right? So let's say, and this is representative of some version of a spiritual attack. So and this is part of the reason I haven't been reading the comments for the most part. It's because when the discourse hits a certain, like a fever pitch, and then Benton is easily allows himself to be distracted visually, and having been such a voracious reader in the past, it's hard for me to see something on the screen and not immediately read and react to it. It's very difficult. Um, Now the emotional reaction is not there quite as strongly as in the past, but not nearly as strongly. And a lot of the emotional reaction of the past was just it's it was my own failure to properly. What I was doing was I was projecting my own sort of intellectual integrity onto other people, right? As if somebody's asking a particular question out of an intellectual curiosity, right? And the purpose, in my view, of a live chat, when it's you know the live streams of the past, and we were doing a different style of broadcast, there was a lot of people just sort of chit chatting and making jokes and making suggestions. But when we get into the actual meat of some sort of spiritual content discourse, then those type of chats, asking certain types of questions, open-ended, broad questions, what's the purpose of asking that based on what the broadcaster is talking about? Like, what's the reason? Is it just, oh, well, I wanted to know, I was curious? It's like, yeah, I have an email address. It's not in the recent, but it's locatable, you know. If a person is actually curious, there's ways to find that out, right? Without waiting for a public, you know, an opportunity to publicly ask a thing, right? That's a non sequitur to the conversation. And then, and I'll just go ahead and I do feel a little annoyance now in the old physicality. So I'm just going to assume this is actually going to be healing. So, are we on to some sort of Buddhic notion of to be grateful for something that could represent an enemy? Because I'm not calling this person my enemy, because what I am doesn't make enemies. But um, certainly Benton has made enemies. That's a different thing. So the point I'm making is, what the commenter said was, have you considered joining the Amish? Right. Well, I've talked about that not being a thing numerous times on this channel, and um can't say that that particular commenter would have heard me say those things, but presumably has listened to me for long enough over time to probably have heard my take on the Amish, and even joining the Amish. And I myself have said, well, in a vacuum, maybe that would be some way, but I don't know that the Amish is accepting 50-year-olds, English people. Is the Amish recruiting 50-year-old English people? Because remember, they call us the English. Anybody who's not Amish is English. And then does the person asking me about the Amish even know that? Right? Like what? And again, in order to further the conversation, what I would like to hear, instead of an open-ended question where I fill in the blanks, where my brain processing power, my acumen, my resources, and my energies then perform based on a question, right? Again, um, you know, I won't even get into the money topic, but there's ways to go about this to incentivize somebody. Again, if there's an actual good faith, oh, I'm curious about, have you ever thought about joining the Amish? Well, I'll answer the question. Yes, I have, and that's called a fantasy. Now, what would a question, what could that question represent in this context when I'm slicing and dicing this world of death and the game of lies? Well, the Amish can also trace their origins to this world of death and game of lies. So, well, that's dead. So, I'm not able, even if the Amish was taking new members, I wouldn't be able to join anyway, because how can what I am join with something that's dead? See, how can the source of life and supreme authority go join death? That doesn't make any sense. There's nothing here to join. What I am when I left my mother's womb was representative of supreme value and authority. So to be the real thing, so to be inserted into a world and taught how to align oneself with wickedness and evil and business and externalities, when all actual real substance only exists within the individual from the individual's perspective. And that is the philosophy of solipsism. From my perspective, this is all that actually tangibly exists. But the external exists, it seemingly exists, but it's animated death. Which, can animated death ever be called life? Well, no, it's not life. It's animated death. So what most people think of as life in this realm, and what I thought of as living up until about 6 months ago, is in fact death warmed over. You ever heard that expression? He or she looks like death warmed over. And usually that happens what? After the individual was so strongly identified with the potential authority and validity of what's going on in this realm, that they've allowed, usually through work or business practices, and then these stresses and pressures of family life and whatever else they've got going on in their personal lives, that's what they've allowed to get them into such a state as somebody else might look at them and say, wow, you look like death warmed over. Or somebody says that they feel like death warmed over. Well, is that not some acknowledgement of animated animated death LARPing as life? Right. And so the person who's able to come on here and exhibit the most intelligent, the highest level of thinking in the so-called truth community, let's loop into problem solving and ask him if he's ever considered joining the Amish. And I'll say, yeah, I fantasize just like everybody else does, or I have my own way of fantasy, but surely we all engage in fantasy, flights of fancy. Here's the difference. I know when I'm fantasizing. Does the just banned user, who may very well have already returned under an AE, alter ego, or what they call a SOC account these days? I missed the transition from AE to SOC, but whatever. Same thing. Um, so that instead of pushing the discourse forward, and fortunately, I was already done with the main discourse, and mostly for time. I'm looking at how much time is left on the StreamYard. So we'll be wrapping up fairly quickly here, the royal we. And see, this could be helpful to that individual who could then, and I'll leave on this, the food for thought is that individual, if they want to do better and internally bootstrap, which I don't know that person's motivations, but here's something that could be worked with, is to then direct their focus, instead of directing them towards me and looping into problem solving around me and my plight, and also to say, have you considered, see, people just simply don't understand their own implications a lot of the time. There's also, it's sort of implying that their life is going in such a way that they have and see, life, again, their animated death within delusion. See, what's the relevance of how the animated death within delusion is structured? Again, clinging to an image to uphold before Moloch, right? It simply does. What is the difference in what does it matter how Benton's day-to-day life looks as long as he's receiving what he needs? Now, what I would say is, see, that we're comparing apples to oranges because Benton is receiving healing. Benton has been delivered from wicked spirits, unclean spirits, demonic spirits. See, Benton is active, has been healed, and is continuing to actively be healed. So to then project onto other people's living situations, and then what? This is also what? An invitation to affirm a lack when what I am is abundance and can never even conceptualize a lack, which is part of being comfortable in the back seat of a 2012 Nissan Versa parked on the streets of Los Angeles. And I'll let y'all's brains figure it, fill in the rest of that critique. And I should, although not necessarily, but there should be time left for one more StreamYard stream in the morning. Peace and respect, Benton and chat. Right back at you, Mr. Moore. Thank you all for listening. Bye.